Hello and welcome to my presentation portion of my final project, the multicultural exploration paper. As you can see, I've decided to focus my paper on the oppression of women. I was interested in this topic because while women have come a long way in regard to equality, the scale still tips in men's favor. It's hard to believe that women's rights are still a relatively new concept in our country, and that sadly it's one that's far from becoming a reality in others. In an effort to fully grasp how this particular population has been marginalized, it's important to recognize how different dynamics in society continue to contribute to the. We begin here with a brief conversation on the history of violating human rights as it pertains to women. Now we know that in the United States, males remain the dominant gender. They represent power, physical strength, and intelligence. Professionally speaking, men have historically been paid more than their female counterparts, have an easier time of climbing the ladder, and statistically hold more prestigious positions. They're more likely to be the aggressor rather than the victim of sexual harassment and abuse, and they were even granted more rights at one point than women were. While the list of human rights that were violated is rather lengthy, we'll focus mostly on 4 here, and that's Articles 4, 5, 17, and 21. Now, the violation of Article 4, as you can see here, it states that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Now, this right is violated still to this day. Human trafficking is a problem, not only in the United States, but also throughout the entire world. While trafficking victims can be either gender or someone who identifies as non-binary, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reports that 71% of the victims are women and girls. Now taking a look at the violation of Article 5. Article 5 reads, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment." However, in India, dowry deaths are linked to the alarming trend that sees 20 women die every day as a result of harassment over a dowry. They're either murdered or compelled to commit suicide. A dowry is the property or the money that a bride's family gifts the groom and his family upon marriage. So if the groom and his family do not feel that the dowry is appropriate enough, the bride will tragically end up dead, her life being of less value than the possessions she brought with her into the marriage. Now, the truly sad part is that in most of these deaths, the husband will report that it was suicide, and no further investigation is done to determine the validity of that claim. So this cruel, torturous treatment is committed daily in India, directly violating the human rights of these women, and nothing is done about it as of yet. Now moving on to the violation of Article 17. Article 17 consists of 2 parts, as you can see here. Part 1 says that everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. And Part 2 is that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. Now, it wasn't until the mid-1800s when Married Women's Property Acts began being passed, recognizing a woman as an individual person with freestanding rights to property ownership and decision-making. So until then, women were viewed as subordinates to their husbands and had no legal ownership of the property that they shared. The violation of Article 21, as you can see here, has 3 parts to it, and it's in the first part where we see the violation occurring. Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. So here, it wasn't until 1920 when women in the United States were allowed to vote per the U.S. Constitution. This pinpoint on the timeline of women being granted the right to vote throughout the world lands somewhere in the middle, actually. New Zealand was the first to grant this in 1893. The UK was in 1918. Mexico was in 1953, Canada in 1960, Iraq in 1980, and it wasn't until 2015, a mere 6 years ago, when Saudi Arabian women won the right to vote. Now, some may argue that many of these examples weren't technically in violation of women's human rights due to when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed, which was December 10th, 1948. Now, this meant that technically the fact that women weren't allowed to own property prior to the mid-1800s was not a violation, and while countries like New Zealand, the US, and the UK were technically not in violation of women's rights, other countries like Mexico, Canada, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia most definitely were. And just because the legality piece was not yet, many of these examples still had moral and ethical violations. There are various forms of oppression, but two in particular that have impacted women are oppression by deprivation and primary oppression. Oppression by deprivation refers to the method of oppression that deprives another or others of an object, role, experience, or set of living conditions that are desirable. This was done by limiting a woman's ability to prosper on her own without the help of a man, be it her father or a husband. This deprivation kept women in a subordinate position to men. Now, the second type of oppression that has impacted women is primary oppression, or the blatant variety, directly perpetrated through either or both of the modalities of force or deprivation. Again, this type of oppression was done by all men who viewed and treated women like their subordinates. Privilege is when members of a dominant group benefit from their belonging to that group. There's a quote that eloquently explains it. Privilege isn't about what you've gone through, it's about what you haven't had to go through. When it comes to gender, men have had the upper hand. Male privilege, or patriarchy, refers to how men are always in a position of power while women are systematically disempowered in every way, from business to household dynamics, and even in their perceived intelligence. Ethnocentricity is when an individual is biased and sees their own culture as the superior way of living. This is true of men prior to the women's rights movement in the 60s and 70s. Back during the first half of the 19th century, women were perceived to be socially and economically inferior to men. The female characters of 1950s and 1960s television were written by men who fully subscribed to the patriarchal mentality. These women were always the quintessential housewife. They almost never worked outside of the home, but instead were shown cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the children, as if these tasks represented the extent of her abilities. They were also often shown meticulously catering to their husbands, looking to them as their leaders, since they knew what was best. As if this portrayal didn't demean women enough, the women were always in a dress and high heels, and she was also in a constant state of happiness. This portrayal deepened the stereotype of women, fed into the male privilege, and set unrealistic expectations for women. Microaggressions are forms of discrimination that both intentionally and unintentionally perpetrate the disrespectful and unequal perception that women are inferior to men. Sadly, for 64% of women, microaggressions are workplace reality. Microaggressions come in many forms. Two in particular are micro-insults and micro-invalidations. These are two very different interactions that a person might have with a female, but both are demeaning and inappropriate. Micro-insults are either interpersonal interactions, which are either verbal or nonverbal, or environmental cues that communicate rudeness, insensitivity, slights, and insults that demean a person's racial, gender, sexual orientation, or group identity and heritage. An example of a micro-insult would be if a person were to tell a woman who decided to leave her career in order to become a stay-at-home mother, "Oh, you've made the best choice because the woman's place is in the home." Perhaps this was meant to be complimentary, but it reflects outdated perceptions that a woman is meant to be in the home while the man is able to have a career. Anissa Bodiat wrote an article about this very topic, where she points out that upon finding out that she made the decision to stay home with her infant, her family members delighted in the fact that she was fulfilling her proper role and worried about whether she planned on breastfeeding, rather than asking her how she felt about leaving her career that she had worked so hard to establish. She wondered, if I were a man, would my family members ask more questions about my retreat from the professional world? In fact, the idea of a stay-at-home dad is still very taboo. Another example of a micro-insult would be making the comment, "Oh, he probably gave you that promotion because you're such a pretty girl." While this statement does try to include some attempt at a compliment, it's actually taking away from this woman's integrity and demerits her accomplishment. Instead of assuming that she worked hard and earned her position, it's implied that her looks alone are her crowning achievement. Considering the fact that women are less likely to be hired into manager-level jobs, and they are far less likely to be promoted into them, this type of micro-insult is incredibly frustrating for many hardworking women. Micro-invalidations, on the other hand, generally occur outside the level of conscious awareness of perpetrators, and directly attack or deny the experiential realities of socially devalued groups. An example of this is when people get angry during the women's marches because they feel that women are already receiving equal treatment. A variation of this is when people also make the comment that women have it easier nowadays because the squeaky wheel gets the grease, meaning that women have spoken out about inequality so much that they now have actually gained more power. It's uncouth for someone to deny the fact that women have had it harder than men. However, on the other hand, some women actually would prefer that society does not focus on the fact that women have historically been the ones who are oppressed. In an excerpt from an article titled, "Please do not refer to us as underrepresented, underserved, marginalized, or minority anymore, thank you," it reads, "Those words are diminishing, belittling, discriminating, and marginalizing. They allude to insufficiency and inadequacy. And the problem with being inadequate or marginalized is that you constantly need handouts to redeem yourself. We are not charitable cases. We just need opportunities that create equitable access to and capital." Now, regardless of the woman's point of view on this topic, micro-invalidations of any kind are irresponsible and do not convey a supportive stance. In our modern world, there is no distinction between female and male mental health. For the most part, mental health problems are not gender-related. However, many years ago, this was not the case. Hysteria was a mental disorder that was believed to be an exclusively female disease with scientific and supernatural origins. Essentially, it was used to describe emotionally charged behavior that seemed excessive and out of control. The treatment for this condition was controversial and included herbs, sex or sexual abstinence, and punishment or purification with fire, among other innovative treatments. It was believed that because women were the weaker, more easily influenced gender, they were the only ones who were afflicted. This is an example of a genetically deficient belief system. The psychologists of the past believed that women were less than men and were more susceptible to certain mental health disorders due to inferiority. As a result of these beliefs, women did not receive the treatment they needed, and the inequality between men and women was reinforced. Fortunately, hysteria was removed from the DSM in 1980. An Emic view is that of an insider's perspective. In an Emic assessment, the observer is either a member of that particular culture or places themselves directly into that culture in order to obtain an in-depth understanding on the details of practices and beliefs of a society that may otherwise have been ignored. An example of an Emic assessment and intervention for the support of women is in Mary Ann Dutton's work, Empowering and Healing the Battered Woman. Dutton recognized the significance that working with other feminists on a primarily female issue had on the battered victims. Essentially, this woman's perspective on a woman's problem was effective in the assessment, intervention, and treatment processes. First, they worked to understand the woman's response to battering, as well as the nature of the abusive behavior. These factors helped inform Dutton's strategies for defining and assessing the abusive behavior, as well as assessing the behavior of the battered woman's response to the abuse. All of this information then allowed Dutton and her colleagues to assemble the framework for her intervention. Without a clear understanding of the experiences of this particular group, Dutton would not have been as successful in her work. Communication styles are not necessarily gender-related, but there are certain generalities that can be made. Academic research has been conducted to examine the differences between how each gender communicates, and it was determined that women use communication as a tool to enhance social connections and create relationships, while men use a language to exert dominance and achieve tangible outcomes. This clearly demonstrates that men either consciously or subconsciously communicate from a position of power. This exertion of dominance through communication can be conveyed through volume, language, and even body language and distance between communicators. Kinesics refers to the hand gestures, facial expressions, and other nonverbal behavior that contributes to the deliverance of a message, whereas proxemics is the amount of space between communicators. These two dynamics are very impactful and can inform the message receiver's perception of the message. For instance, Middle Eastern cultures tend to prefer a closer personal space at about 8 to 12 inches between communicators, whereas North Americans prefer a distance of about 18 inches. Therefore, if two Middle Eastern communicators stood in close proximity to one another, nothing about the conversation would seem off. However, if a Middle Eastern communicator was standing within close proximity to a North American, the North American might feel a little uncomfortable and might perceive the message through a different lens. While culture plays a large role in these dynamics, we can also see substantial differences between men and women that stems from the patriarchal mindset. Women tend to display a more closed body language, which researchers hypothesize may stem from a cultural convention to appear smaller. This is in contrast to men who generally choose a wider stance to increase their size, indicating confidence and asserting dominance. The same mentality is infused into the conversation through proxemics. Studies show that men encroach more frequently upon a female space, which establishes male dominance and female submission. Improving communication between men and women while working to eliminate the gender inequity that occurs is an important aspect a human services professional can help women to accomplish. While women are statistically better at reading body language, picking up on nonverbal cues, and listening, they can be overly emotional and non-authoritative. A human services professional can work with women to equip them with communication skills that they can convey in a more assertive, confident way. They can also serve as an advocate on behalf of women, communicating their needs for them. Advocacy is the support of an individual or a group with the goal of helping them achieve their full potential. A human services professional could serve as an advocate for women in a variety of ways. First, they could work to counsel women who might have been discriminated against because of their gender. Women may experience certain biological, environmental, and psychosocial challenges related to gender, and these concerns can have a significant impact on mental health and well-being. Another way is to work for an advocacy organization. There are several different organizations out there, including ones that fight for women's reproductive rights, such as the Center for Reproductive Rights. Another that works to ensure a safe, fair, and dignified workplace, and that's in Time's Up. and then another that works to help battered women, which is the mission of the Battered Women's Justice Project. All of these organizations, along with many like them, work to bring awareness to gender inequality issues and demand change through policy reform. Now for the personal piece to this project. So prior to entering the Human Services program, I had a general idea of what kind of work I wanted to do. After going through a difficult divorce and navigating life as a single mom of young children, I eventually discovered that I wanted to help other women who found themselves in a position similar to mine. I fantasized about helping women find happiness and strength after a traumatic experience. I just sort of assumed that I would be working with this population more than any other. I feel that this perspective that I have to empower women is really going to benefit the work that I do in the future with this population. I'm passionate about advocating on behalf of them, as well as equipping them with the skills that they need to reach their full potential. One way I could see how my worldview might negatively impact my work with this population is that I might view every woman's situation through the lens of my own experiences. In some cases, personal disclosure can be helpful to build a therapeutic relationship, but I would need to be careful how much I share and to make sure that I didn't taint the experiences and feelings of a client with my own. I believe that it's important to always strive for improvement. In order to best serve this population, I would stay current on the issues that impact women. I also know of a few human service professionals who annually travel down to our state's capital to advocate on behalf of the population that they serve, and I could see myself doing this as well.